All other sounds were shut out by the howling wind as the forest screamed in the fierce storm. As it poured down rain, I looked through the trees for any sign of cover, my clothes soaked through. Even though there didn't seem to be any protection in this wild, wild place, I kept going through the storm. I thought all hope was lost until I saw a faint glow between the shaking trees. I fought my way towards it, bracing myself against the fury of the elements. I arrived at a lone wooden house that was just barely visible through the rain. As night fell early under the storm's cover, a dim flicker of light flashed from inside. I stumbled toward the door and hit the worn-out wood with my numb hands. After a very long time of waiting, the door finally creaked open just enough to show a cautious old man's face. His hair and beard were a tangled mess that framed his deep-set eyes, which sparkled with a brightness that cut through the chaos of the storm. He opened the door for me without saying a word, being careful not to make a joke about how wet I was. I thanked him very much, and then he locked the door behind me. The stormy winds were blocked out, but I felt nervous being around this stranger. A cozy fire kept the one-room house warm, even though it wasn't very fancy. I introduced myself nicely and told them that I was traveling through these woods by myself before the rain got in the way. With a short nod, the man acknowledged what I said and looked at the fire. "Get dry, because that storm doesn't seem to be stopping. You're welcome to rest here until it goes away," he said in a rough voice from not using it in a while. His manner was polite, but he didn't say his name or give any information about how he lived alone in these remote woods. There was an odd silence as the fire popped and cracked, sounding a lot like the howls coming from the woods beyond our shelter. I didn't want to accept the change of dry clothes that had been left folded by the fire until I was kindly told to do so. Since I had some privacy, I took off my wet clothes and put them on next to the warm fire. We could hear a deep boom coming from outside. The walls around us were shaking as if an old tree had just died in the storm. My host stood still in the wavering firelight, like a taxidermied animal, and stared at me with such intensity that it made me cold and had nothing to do with the wet clothes that had been thrown away by the flames. The cold night went by slowly as I tried to sleep but couldn't find a comfortable place to stay. When dawn's soft light finally came through the cracks in the walls, my host was already up and doing things that didn't seem to have anything to do with the talk. The man moved in jerky, agitated ways, as if he were filled with a nerve energy that was much stronger than normal nervousness. Breakfast was short and quiet. It was just strong tea and rough bread with no ceremony or offer to share the meal. My host still hadn't given me any information that would help me figure out who he was, other than the fact that he lived in this remote sanctuary and seemed determined to keep his personal past vague. Even though he was kind enough to give shelter from the storm, there was a deep sense of unease in every interaction between us. Even though the roaring winds outside had died down a bit, the rain kept beating on the wooden walls and roof nonstop. It didn't look like anyone could get away until the break in the weather. I decided not to ask my wary host any more questions and instead took my time exploring the few rooms that were available. I was interested in the one book on a shelf. It was an old book of local stories and tales, and the pages were yellowing from age. As I turned the pages, creepy woodcut pictures of monsters and strange disappearances that happened in these woods hundreds of years ago caught my attention. A loud crash from outside broke the cabin's thin sense of being alone. When my host and I slammed the door and threw back the heavy bolts, we saw that a huge oak had finally died from the storm. Its huge trunk was lying across the path that led into the thick forest. Just beyond, something moved quickly behind the trees and disappeared into the darkness before we could make out what it was. Before securing the bolts again, my friend let out a low, ominous laugh and mumbled something I couldn't understand. The only thing that caused the crash was an old tree. "Let me show you the way around. We might feel better after a walk." I didn't want to agree, but I did, even though I felt uneasy. As we took the side path around the downed oak, the trees seemed to get closer together, making the woods feel more stifling. The way my host led was strange. He loped along as if he were about to run or fight. He stopped all of a sudden and knelt down, motioning for me to do the same. A hunched figure moved in the distance through the sheets of rain. It dragged one leg as it sniffed the air and slowly turned its deformed head toward us. It looked back at us with two spots of light that almost looked like eyes. But then it moved off into the woods. Then, my guide got up with a grim face and motioned for me to follow him back to the cabin in silence. We rushed through the squelching mud. That night, strange sounds came from outside the walls of protection. They were low moans of pain or anger that could be heard through the wind and rain. As I stared out into the pitch, black night, my host muttered something to himself that I couldn't understand. I was afraid of what was lurking so close. I couldn't fall asleep because my thoughts were filled with an unnamed fear. When dawn finally came back, I would ask this man about the noises in the night, the thing in the woods, and the shadow that kept following him around. Finding this forest's dark secret seemed like the only way to get away from its killing grip. I woke up with a start when I heard a choking, guttural scream through the roaring winds. My host jumped up from his creaky chair by the dying fire and looked around the cottage walls with wide eyes for signs of a breach. In the middle of the night, there was another strange howl. This time, much closer. It was followed by a beating and scratching sound coming from the heavy front door. The old wood cracked into small pieces when huge force hit the old building. My guide took a rusty hatchet from the shelf, without saying a word, and waved for me to follow. We crept around to the back of the single room and pushed back a worn-out rag rug to find a narrow trapdoor made of rough wood. As if from deeper than seen, a rotting smell rose up. Right away, he rasped and dropped down quickly into the cellar. For someone so old and dirty, he was very agile. I climbed down the broken ladder and into a huge earthen room that was only lit by a single guttering light. The trapdoor shut tightly above us. From our dark hiding place, loud bangs shook the floors above us as sharp claws tore into the hide of the cabin. As the attack came, the wood broke and buckled, and inhuman roars and clicking sounds filled the air with a crazed hunger. My friend stood very still, hatchet in hand, and stared up at the changing shadows that played on the rough grain of the trapdoor. Finally, there was a strange quiet again. We were afraid to breathe for a long time until the old man finally gave us the all. Clear and opened the door a crack. There were disgusting sights waiting for us, where furniture and buildings used to be. When I caught a whiff of the smell that hung thick in the hollow, I was thrown back with a gag, hitting the clay walls that seemed to close in around me with every gasping breath. My guide stayed strangely calm, looking up at the damaged space with the cold detachedness of a scholar. "It knows we still live," was his grim judgment. "The hunt is still going on." When dawn came, it didn't bring any comfort or a way out. It only made us realize how horrible it was that we were trapped in this cursed tomb with a horrible predator watching over us. My friend broke the uncomfortable silence by talking about the shadow that has been following him through these old woods since he was a child. A strange tribe curse and a cannibal cult that spread its evil ways to strangers like me, who were not supposed to be there and stayed too long in this forest wilderness. We had to figure out how to trick the crazy person and fight for our lives in a place where morals and the law didn't apply. We would make the monster follow our rules when night came back. In the dark, I helped move things from the hatch so that climbing tools could be made from the broken pieces above. The sharp, chuckling head of my guide's hatchet gave me chills, but it wasn't very good against such an awful thing. After getting as many weapons as the situation would allow, it was time to face our fate, which was waiting for us on that dark, killing floor that the monster had now taken as its home. We were dragged one by one into a scene from the depths of hell, waiting for an attack that never came. Instead, there was a scary, expectant quiet. Then I heard a moving sound coming from the shadows. A low moan came from the pitch, black darkness, and it was joined by raspy breaths and the sound of curved claws scraping old floors. Even though my blood ran cold, I stood my ground with my hatchet raised as a huge shape came loose from the walls. Two glowing eyes looked at us from a head that wasn't shaped right. They were wild and smart. This was the Watcher of the Woods come to life. It was the twisted history of this forest. It charged with a scary howl and moved too fast for its size. I swung with all my strength, but all I did was cut through empty air as it veered off to the side with unnatural ease. When it hit my partner, a rough backhand sent me flying into broken pieces. I saw a flurry of cuts and snapping jaws through a pulsing haze. The crone matched its wild strength blow for blow. The hatchet bit deep and got stuck fast in thick fur and twisted bone, making a wet crunch sound. The animal let out a painful roar, which made the old man in the woods smile in a cold, wild way. Getting my bearings, I rejoined the fight with sharp sticks I had found in the rubble. Our enemy was tired, but it kept attacking without caring about pain or survival. As the fight went on, black ichor covered the ground, and its minions watched from the woods that were closing in on the broken-down shelter without being seen. We beat the writhing monster with a Herculean effort and slammed it into the cold ground with the hatchet and stakes, crushing it to death. When the last twitch stopped, there was a strange quiet again. As dawn crept over the doorway, it showed 3 figures among the blood and broken bones. My friend stood there, bloody but not bowed. This is an age-old way of getting revenge when law and decorum don't apply. I had made it through this experience, emerging strong-willed but forever changed on the inside. Regarding the dead body lying at our feet, the forest would eventually take back that unclean body part. But its cycle of pain was over. The old woodsman led me away from the killing ground, showing me the way through the clearing mists to safety in the woods, away from the ghosts that still lived there. But even though the storm was over, its effects would last forever in these wild primevals. As I finished putting away the last of my books, I looked out my bedroom window and saw the mountains in the distance. I sighed as I thought about the huge forest that stood between our new summer home and the rest of the world. At age 17, my shyness had turned into boredom as I drove through our hometown's twisting mountain roads. But this shack in the middle of nowhere held unknown horrors that went beyond being alone. Megan, my younger sister, was excited about going mushroom hunting and making new friends. But I had darker thoughts in these lonely woods. It was Mom calling from below. "Nora, dinner." I got myself together and went downstairs. The house was simple but warm, with a fireplace that crackled. While we ate, I kept looking at the black shapes that were moving across the windows. Dad said it was a busy day fixing the roof in the hot sun, but the dark circles under his eyes told him he had bigger problems. Mom talked about fun things we could do to pass the time, but her happiness didn't seem real. Megan was the only one who stayed positive, and she started making plans for early morning walks. Forced cheer covered up family unease, which made me slurp down my food. When I looked outside, I saw movement in the tree line. It was a pale figure watching from behind the trees. It was gone when I blinked. Dad looked into the dark and asked, "Nothing. Just tired, I think." I left early because I was scared. When I read in my attic bedroom, the light was getting dim, and the shadows moved across the knotted wood. I woke up when I heard a bang from downstairs. No one's steps could be heard as they climbed and then disappeared. I held my breath and listened for familiar sounds, but all I could hear were the trees and the cabin creaking. When it got really dark, with moonlight shining through thick branches, I felt very uneasy. A scary howl came from deep in the woods and sent chills down my spine. No matter how hard I tried to sleep, the call kept humming over and over in progressively louder tones. It joined other strange sounds that were floating through my open window on the cool breeze. When I woke up in the morning, I was tired and lost, and the family was already eating breakfast downstairs. Dad's eyes were dark, and Mom's hands were shaking so much that they spilled coffee. Only Megan, who is always happy, stayed the same. "Rough night," Dad said in a stern voice. "Heard things out there I can't explain." Mom gripped her coffee mug tighter. "I saw someone at the edge of the property yesterday, but they vanished so quickly." My heart stopped beating. I also thought I saw someone in the trees yesterday, even though we were eating. Megan laughed. "Most likely a deer. What a crazy story you're making up in these woods, Nora." But Dad's sad face made dismissals seem unlikely. As we ate in silence, each of us thinking about our own terrible dreams from the night before. When would being alone drive us crazy or something worse appear in the forest? I promised to find out the truth about our unwanted watcher, because our safety relied on facing creeping threats instead of denying they exist. That night, I went out on the back porch and took a deep breath of the pine-scented air, hoping that new ideas would calm my jitters. I could only see darker shadows. The tree line was like an impenetrable wall, and beyond the trees were already dark holes at dusk. There was a loud snap coming from inside. I walked slowly around the cabin, following the noise. When I saw the tools that were lying in the leaves along a path that led deeper into the dark forest, it took my breath away. Dad's hammer was lying at the edge of the trees. Paint cans were further away, and his saw was just inside the first ring of pines. I felt scared because an unseen hand seemed to pull me into the dark woods. I ran inside and slammed the door shut behind me. I watched the last rays of sun go down behind thick trees through the curtained window. The trees were still, but the pine boughs moved slowly, like they were in the wind. Pale eyes looked back at me from their branches. I felt a cold lump in my throat. We were being pushed into this stranger's territory like prey. That night, every creak and groan of settling wood woke me up from my erratic dreams. Outside, twigs scratched my window in jerky, irregular ways. With a torch as a lifeline, I slid out of my sweaty sheets and made my way downstairs to get water around midnight. In the dark kitchen, a shadow broke off from the storeroom. Megan's pale face was in the beam as I screamed and flailed my light. She put her finger to her shaking lips and motioned for me to join her by the back door, where she was holding a heavy skillet. A strange howl came from inside the trees, like demons in pain. We both shook as Megan gasped, and I squeezed her hand. The wail got louder, as if it were going around our double-pane windows and measuring how weak we were from the outside. Then, heavy footsteps shook the leaves off the trees as they went back into the woods. We stayed by the door and clung to it until the light of morning slowly came back. We both didn't dare close our eyes again that night. We kept a close eye on the doors and windows until dawn's wet rays didn't give us much comfort. At breakfast, no one talked about how scared we were, but our pale faces made it clear. Over the next few days, each night brought more and more strange things. Flickering shadows moving through windows, scratching claws, cutting into wood siding. Some tools went missing and then came back in strange places, like a hoe stuck in the roof of the tool shed or a shovel-sunk blade, down in soft ground like it was planting a hellish seed. In her nightmares, Nora was being chased through pitch black woods by a pale, gangly thing that looked familiar but was so horribly wrong. She woke up panting and scratching at her sheets. She felt like someone was watching her from behind. One night, our stressed-out mom broke down in tears and begged to leave this evil place. But more and more activity showed that escape would not be easy. Dad locked the doors and got out an old hunting gun, making plans for how to finally face this presence that was making us crazy by being alone. One night, I woke up alone from a series of bad dreams. I went downstairs to get some water, saw that the back door was slightly open. There were a lot of acorns and pine cones on the porch, covering the worn-out boards. There were also scuff marks that went out into the dark forest. My chest got hot and shaky with fear. One by one, we were taken away from the supposed safety of this falling apart haven. I threw open the door to disappear into the dark. As I ran into the Stygian trees, The weak beam of my flashlight scared away shadows. I couldn't tell whose path I was following because of the rotting leaves that crunched under my feet. Soon after, an unearthly howl grew louder and closer, changing pitch and volume so slowly, it was like it was trying my sanity. I ran wildly toward the scream, getting hit by branches. Megan was bound and gagged under twisted branches when my light broke into a small opening. Her eyes begged me to help her. Beyond, larger trees grew in an unnatural way, crowding in until there was only a narrow passageway left. Down, it shuffled a pale body with a head that hung down. Long, mottled fingers calling me to follow. "No!" I screamed, grabbed Megan's bound body and ran the other way. The path I picked, though, was blocked by branches that I couldn't get past, and that chilling call followed us around. Soon, we were going in circles, and with each ragged breath, our hope was dwindling. Finally, a huge tree trunk blocked our way out, and we gathered together, panting, while we waited for death to grab us in this strange asylum. Like setting. The night was broken by the sound of a gun. Heavy footsteps smashed into us as a huge figure rushed into view and wrapped its arms around us to protect us. Dad, as he half carried, half dragged us out of that scary place. I sobbed into his sweaty shirt. When we got back to the cabin, Mom rocked and prayed over our shaking bodies. At that point, I saw that Dad's torso was bleeding. 3 parallel cuts ran down his side, where claw-like claws had grabbed him. His gun was lying on the ground with 3 spent rounds inside. The horrible thing that was following us out of the woods was bleeding, but it didn't seem willing or able to be killed. Our heated argument turned into yelling. This threat that no one could understand put a lot of stress on family relationships. Megan screamed out in anger and confusion, saying that my delusions were putting us all in danger. Even though the roads were eerily shut, Mom screamed for help. Still, something kept us locked inside the suffocating walls, scaring our weak spirits night after night. Finally, just before dawn, there was a huge impact that shook our shelter to its core. As we ran outside, we were shocked to see that our car, which had been parked safely days before, was now smashed against the tool shed in a horrible mess of broken glass and twisted metal. A message that couldn't be put into words was written along its damaged side. There is no escape. When dawn came up, we huddled inside, shaking, blocking every crack in the walls against the evil wants of whoever owned these wooded domains. But as the sun started to shine through the deepest shadows, our invisible attacker seemed to move away. At noon, its power was at its weakest. Dad said with a sad heart that the only way to save ourselves was to face this thing on its own terms, in the deepest parts of its domain. So, in the middle of the afternoon, the father and daughter went into the light-filled tunnel, ready for whatever terrors they might find there. We looked for signs of life in the forest for 2 hours, going back and forth on flat paths through whispering pines. There was more hope that facing our fears had removed some veil. But as the shadows got longer, a sharp scream broke that hope. We ran quickly toward the sound and came out into a small clearing with only one thing. Megan's torn nightgown stuck on some sharp sticks. Beyond, as far as the eye could see into the wild wood, an evil chorus rang out in a hellish uproar. We ran away from that evil place together, holding Dad's shaking hand. Our family ties were hurt, but not broken. Behind us, the forest looked like it was sighing, and its watchful guards were moving back into the shadows to be alone. Their true nature was just as mysterious as the quiet mountain's old secrets. When Adam got to the out of the way house, it was already dark. He turned off the engine and cautiously looked through the glass at the shape that was coming closer. Its walls were empty and dark, with not a single light shining inside. Adam's doubts grew as he packed his bags. He could feel the heavy weight of being alone weighing on him, even though he chose this alone trip to disconnect. The crushing vastness around him started to feel deep. Adam stumbled around in the dark until he found the heavy door and pushed it open. As he looked around his temporary home, the beams of his phone light showed dust dancing. The small space was filled with stripped-down furniture that didn't offer any comforts, just a clean place to hide from the risks outside. In the main room, a single hanging bulb flickered overhead, creating a weak glow that didn't do much to keep the shadows from getting too close. Adam tried the switches, but they didn't work. He was once again in the dark. His fingers were moving quickly across the phone as he sent a message to the host about the power problems, hoping that they would answer quickly. There was only quiet. Adam sighed and started unpacking the few food items he had brought, eager to take his mind off of things. When I opened the cabinets, I saw that the previous owners had left few things behind. A half-full bottle of water, a can of beans, and tea bags made up the cupboard. Clearly, not many people stayed here, and it didn't offer much either. As soon as Adam sat down on the lumpy couch, a loud knocking sound could be heard throughout the house. With his heart in his mouth, he hesitantly crossed to the door and peered out into the dark. "Hello?" A worn-out figure appeared in front of him, coming out of the darkness like a ghost. The bones in their faces were bent into a smile that might have been meant to be friendly, but came across as grimacing. "Evenin'. I'm the owner. Name's Talbot." His voice was rough, like rusty doors swinging open, and it made Adam's nerves hurt. Adam had never seen Talbot's teeth so big, but his eyes had a disturbing void that made him feel more uneasy than any growl could. As politely as he could, Adam told the man what was wrong while watching his eyes roam around the room, hungry for information. Talbot slowly nodded, as if his mind was somewhere else. "Reckon the old generator must be on the Fritz Inn. I'll have a look. See." He walked right past Adam and into the cabin without waiting to be invited. Adam cautiously followed Talbot while keeping his distance as he began his quick inspection. The big man rummaged through closets and peered under furniture, stirring up dust and cobwebs as he did so. He was also mumbling something that no one could understand. When Talbot got out from under the sink after a few minutes of grunting, he wiped his dirty hands on his grease-stained pants. "Ain't nothin' I can do tonight, I'm afraid. Generator's on its last legs, needs parts I ain't got. Reckon you'll just have to rough it till mornin'. I'll swing by first light with a replacement." Adam looked around at the dark, isolating shadows and felt very alone as his words didn't help much. Talbot's noticeable lack of a car also made them feel uneasy because it reminded them how far away help was in case something went wrong. Adam thanked the man and nodded, eager to see him go, but Talbot stood by the door for a while, as if he had forgotten something. He was rocking back and forth in his worn-out work boots, while his face furrowed in that unsettling, empty way. "Are you going to stay for a long time?" Adam thought the question was odd and rude for a first meeting. He gave a bland answer, just a few nights, hoping that was enough. Talbot slowly ate this, his eyes never leaving Adam's face like beetles. There was a nervous moment before the owner smiled again, this time in a way that seemed almost predatory. "Okay, now you be careful. Enjoy the quiet and peace." With that threatening goodbye, Talbot swung open the creaking door and disappeared into the night, leaving Adam feeling very alone. He checked the locks and locked all the windows because the man's obvious strangeness and his prowling at night scared him. There was something wrong with Talbot and this place. He was so tired that he was leaning against the wall, and the phone light flickered across his face. Outside, Adam felt a chill go down his spine as he heard a mysterious rustling coming from the growing forest. What or who was hiding behind the weak bulb's light? He had come to these wild woods to be alone, but all he found was more and more uneasiness. This night, it would be hard to fall asleep. As the last rays of twilight went out of sight, blackness fell over the cabin. Adam sat tensely by the bulb that was flickering and reading the same passage over and over again without understanding it. His thoughts were not on the pages at all. They kept going back to looking out into the pitch, black space beyond the thin walls. Adam looked dirty as the first pale rays of dawn came in through dirty windows and lit up his face. He had only gotten a few hours of sleep because he woke up at the slightest sound and scanned the room in a crazy state of anxiety. In his jumbled mind, shadows and made-up threats were everywhere. Adam woke up from his sleepy state when he heard noise outside. Fear gripped him right away. He slowly made his way to the window, his body aching for rest, but high on energy. As I looked into the dimming darkness, nothing stood out among the crooked tree branches. Was it a dream caused by not getting enough sleep? His attention was drawn lower, where the green grass slowly split apart. Glancing at him with eyes that looked like they were hunting, they slithered back into cover. Adam gasped for air and fear and fell backwards from the window pane. They were still out there, watching for any sign of weakness like hawks. That made things clear. There is no place to hide or sleep here, because there are demons at the door. Adam sighed and grabbed his bag and phone. He checked to make sure the phone was useless before putting it away. He threw open the cabin door and ran straight into the thick forest, covering as much ground as his strong legs could take him. Angry tree branches slashed at each other, grabbing clothes and skin alike. Snapping twigs and rustling undergrowth echoed his terrified run, making every mistake he made more obvious to anyone sneakily following him. Adam swatted away spider webs and swung his huge body through thickets, not caring where the road led as long as it led to safety. Adam kept fighting hard, even though he was tired and scared, and sweat and tears were running down his face. Lungs burned from breathing quickly, and legs hurt and complained every yard they went into the wilds that didn't care. But stopping meant giving in to the nameless predators who had trapped him in this nightmare. The things that were chasing him out of sight, not sound, could only be stopped by steady movement. Adam didn't know how long he had been flying through the treeless forest. In this race for life, time stopped being important. Putting one foot in front of the other into the unknown was all that mattered. Finally, blessed sunlight broke through the mist as he stumbled out of the trees and onto an empty stretch of cracked blacktop. Adam fell to his knees and retched fiercely as his muscles screamed for more oxygen. He turned around quickly to look at the tree line, scared that wild animals would jump out from behind the trees at any time. But all he could see were swaying trees. There was no longer any sign of predators waiting for the right time. As Adam's power slowly came back, he shakily got to his feet and pulled out his phone with shaking hands. Still, no signal came back to his hopeful swipes. In these tough times, this device is as useful as Tinder. He didn't know which way to go to get help because he was stuck on this empty stretch of land under a clear sky. His car was still somewhere outside those trees, and the keys were lost in the chaos of the flight. Adam felt more like breaking down than at any other time because he was stuck and alone, and bad things were still hiding somewhere out of sight. He kept going down the lonely path, even though his body hurt because his survival reflexes kicked in. Going forward held more hope than going back into the dangerous arms of that unnatural forest. Adam fell asleep for hours as he walked mile after tired mile, his arms around him to keep them warm against the cold. Still, the endless rows of trees stood like guardians on either side, not letting anyone leave their territory. His feet were bleeding freely, and with each heavy step forward into the hot afternoon, his legs seemed ready to rebel. Heat stroke and a lack of hope took what little strength was left, and the person was getting close to giving up. Then, while he was still feeling very tired, he noticed movement ahead of him. A dirty pickup truck came around a corner and slowly made its way toward him. Adam waved wildly and held back tears of relief as the tires came to a stop. Soon, strong arms pulled his weak body inside to the cool air conditioning, finally waking him up from this bad dream. It didn't matter where or how far they went. They just had to get out of that dark forest and away from all the scary things that lived in its twisted heart. Sometimes a strange sound would break the quiet, which made him jump out of his chair and slam hard against the window. But at night, the crooked tree roots made it hard to see any signs of life or movement. Still, he felt like eyes were watching him from behind, paying close attention to every tiny movement inside the house. The silence was broken by a rough howl that was too close to be safe. More voices joined in, and Adam's heart got stuck in his throat. The tiny clearing was filled with the sound of eerie voices. As he quickly searched through his phone's apps for even a single bar, he grabbed it from the table. But as before, his search turned up nothing but an endless void. The device was just as useless against the forces of the night as he was. Adam sighed and sank back into his chair, trying to hear anything outside the weak door. The lonely background noise was made up of crickets and owls, with scary cracklings and rustling coming from the thick forest. Each passing moment of sounds he couldn't understand carried on the wind made the pictures in his mind scarier. What kind of animals were coming so close in the dark? Could Talbot be stalking the outside right now, his eyes sparkling with hunger in the bushes? Adam's paranoia grew, making him more afraid until it seemed like every shadow was a threat. The thin blanket was pulled closer around him, and all he could think about was dawn and answers outside these walls. Time moved so slowly that minutes seemed like hours in the smothering silence. Then, out of the blue, a huge beating hit the cabin from outside, shaking the old wood. Adam yelled and jumped up, his heart beating faster than before. The door kept getting hit hard, like by a battering ram, which kept shaking dust off the ceiling. Rushing sounds joined the chaos, as if some animal was scratching and clawing desperately to get inside. Adam slid backwards in fear, holding out his phone as the only weak defense against the dreams coming from outside. The noise got louder and louder, an unholy serenade of anger and hunger calling for people to come into his haven. Adam was so scared that he couldn't do anything but watch as the door bucked inward with each blow, almost giving way from the constant pressure. He was scared and gasped for air, waiting for the weak barrier to break apart at any moment and let out whatever evil force was outside. He wanted so badly to just disappear into the floors and get away from this nightmare that was happening in the middle of the night. The beating stopped just as quickly as it had begun. Adam stood still as a rock, barely daring to breathe for fear of waking up the sleeping beast again. After a painful time, there was no sound coming from outside the hut walls. The only sounds that broke the deep silence were his rough breaths and thundering heartbeat. Adam took a tentative look out the window and saw blurry figures disappearing into the darkness and becoming part of the night. He couldn't tell if they were people or animals, and their leaving didn't make him feel better. His phone still wouldn't let him call for help, which made him feel even more alone and vulnerable. While monsters lurked just outside the weak walls, sleep would not come. Adam huddled in his chair against the corner and held his phone up to his ear like a charm. He prayed that the break of dawn would drive these evil spirits away. It didn't get any better when midnight came, making the cage deeper like a suffocating tomb. Every creak and noise brought back his fear, taking him back to that moment of complete terror as he waited for destruction from an evil he couldn't know. Around the witching hour, he finally fell asleep from being so tired. But in his dream world, darker shadows came in and chased him through a crumbling forest house over and over again. When Adam woke up before dawn, he was drenched in cold sweat and found that there was silence once more beyond the walls that were covering him. Are the things he couldn't name also at rest? Or did they follow him around in his mind like the woods? Dawn seemed like it would never come. Adam fell asleep while watching strange scenery pass by the windows. The rumbling diesel engine put him to sleep. When they became aware again, it was getting dark, and the truck was stopped outside of a roadside diner that was lit up by neon lights. Hank, a rough-looking cowboy who saved him, gently woke him up and helped him hobble inside. While eating burgers and drinking coffee, Adam talked about the scary events that had made him so crazy, trying to make sense of things that were beyond his understanding. Hank listened carefully and chewed slowly as the puzzle pieces came together. "Son, it sounds like you caused a problem that should have been left alone in those woods. Take it from me. Some places aren't meant for people." Soon after, Adam's desperate phone call finally reached someone. Police came. He told the cops everything they needed to know, including Talbot's strange behavior and the attacks on the cabin at night. The police officers traded uneasy looks. It was clear that the disturbing story was bothering them, but they didn't have any solid proof of wrongdoing. "We need to check out that place and see what we can find. Hold on tight with Hank until we find out more, okay? Get some rest." Before leaving into the night, one of the uniforms smiled in a reassuring way, and Hank joined them to help them find their way along the unknown trails. Adam couldn't fall asleep, though, because his mind kept repeating those brief images of hungry eyes watching him from the bushes. When dawn came, there had been no word from the police, which made him even more worried. He quickly became tired and finally fell asleep in the truck, where he could escape into dreamless darkness. When he became aware again, Hank woke him up with excitement. "Dude, the police just told us over the radio that they found something." Adam slowly walked after the rancher's loping gait. He was filled with fear as he thought about the new horrors that were about to come out. A police car sat still outside the cabin clearing as they came out from behind the trees. Inside, police officers sifted through prints and took pictures of the empty building. Someone said, "It looks like someone's been squatting here lately," pointing out the disturbed dust and shelves that had just been filled with canned goods. At first glance, the place looked like it was empty, but cleverly hidden signs of recent activity showed that it had been inhabited. Back in the woods, more officers carefully searched the tree line. Voice. "Officer, look at these strange marks," the voice said. When Adam and Hank walked over, they saw deep cuts in the ground and scrapes on nearby tree branches that reached high into the air. He had never seen an animal that was so tall or left such intentional marks. Even stranger, groups of symbols had been carefully placed nearby, and strange geometric patterns had been carefully carved into the soft ground. Their meaning stayed completely unclear, which made them even more unsettling. The ominous mood was made even worse by Talbot's strange disappearance and the uncanny feeling that people were watching them from all sides. Since there didn't seem to be any clear answers, the police took Adam back to town so he could answer more questions at the station. During questioning, his story didn't change. The facts started to fit, but the motive and the people responsible stayed elusive. In the end, everyone agreed that common sense should have been used. There were some riddles that were better left unsolved than to be dug up in the middle of nowhere. He got away with his life, at least. As night fell again, Adam was dropped off at Hank's house by a squad car. Hank agreed to lend Adam a deputy to follow him back to the city when the sun came up. As the cruiser's headlights went out, Adam looked back somberly at the shape of the forest on the horizon. As before, shadows seemed to move and swirl in the Stygian void, but he couldn't tell what was watching. Who or what was really hiding among those twisted trees was still unknown in the dark night. It looked like the road through the thick bush would never end. The battered pickup truck shook as it went over the bumpy dirt road. Tall pine and oak trees towered over it, their branches intertwining high above like grasping fingers, blocking out the dull gray sky. As he drove, David kept his eyes on the window and used the few faded signs nailed crookedly to tree trunks to help him find his way. There it was. After being alone on the path for more than an hour, a small wooden cabin could be seen in the distance. It was sitting quietly by itself, far from any signs of people or things, as David had hoped to find after everything that had happened. He stopped the truck and went outside. As he took in his new surroundings, he breathed in the rich smells of wet earth and pine needles. He didn't expect the house to be so small. It had brown paint that was peeling off and a rusty metal roof. Dry moss stuck to the walls between pieces of broken wood. On the front, There was only one window that looked out like an empty eye. David went up to the door and turned the knob. It was unlocked, just like the real estate agent said it would be. He squeaked it open and looked inside. The inside wasn't very fancy, but it worked fine. A simple table and chairs made of wood, a worn-out couch, and a stove with a potbelly for heat. There were stiff covers on the bed in the corner room. It looked bad, but David planned to stay there for a few weeks while he got his life together. Much better than being sad in an empty house in town where memories keep coming back to haunt you. David got to work, bringing his few bags of food and materials from the truck inside. Thoughts that were bothering him kept coming back to him, even though he was busy with things like unpacking canned goods and piling firewood. Picture her with him and see how sad she looked as she told him it was over. It all took place so quickly. Under the thick forest, night fell quickly. David lit the pot-bellied stove on fire and sat down with a can of beans next to it to watch the flames dance across the walls of the house. Outside, it got darker in the woods. The only sound in the heavy quiet was an owl hooting far away. David then saw it, a strange yellowish glow that went deep into the trees and was hard to see through the windows. It didn't move. It looked like it was floating among the black trees. But as far as he knew, there were no lights outside. He looked again after rubbing his eyes, but it was gone. David thought it had to be the brightness of the fire playing tricks on his tired mind. He was ready to rest and forget about his problems, even if it was just for the night. Is that so? But it wasn't easy to fall asleep. David was sure he could hear things outside through the thin walls. He kept hearing faint rustlings and crunches that might have been animals, or something else. He told himself that it was all in his head, and that he had too many bad thoughts and was alone too much. Eventually, he fell into a fitful sleep because he was so tired. The next morning, David went outside and carefully looked around the edges of the small area. But nothing was left of what had made the sounds or lights the night before. Only leaves pushed around by the wind and small claw marks in the ground, most likely from a fox or raccoon. Whatever it was no longer there. David told himself not to worry and jump around so much about nothing. The trip was meant to help him forget, not make things worse. But the more time he spent alone in the remote cabin, the more uneasy he felt about things that had nothing to do with past pain. 3 nights later, the strange light in the woods came back. David was reading by a lamp when he noticed movement in the corner of his eye. He looked up and saw the same dull yellow glow hanging in the woods far away, as if it were calling him. David looked at it with anger. This wasn't just a light or tired mind trick. There was something out there that showed itself to him on purpose every night. David got up early the next morning because he couldn't sleep. A light mist hung low over the forest floor as he searched for signs around the edges of the small clearing. At that moment, he saw the strange tracks that went around the whole cabin, as if something had crept up on them during the night. David bent down to look at them more closely. The prints were long and deep, and the animal's 4 spread-out toes were not like any he knew. Considering the size, the space between each picture was way too long. What was scariest was that the prints looked like they were glowing lightly when they were on the wet ground. David shook and rubbed his eyes in shock, but the prints were still there, a clear sign of the ghostly presence that was haunting him alone. David began to notice other small changes as the days went by. There were strange sounds coming from the woods all the time, like someone was watching him while he slept, never far away. When he got too close to the tree line, the calls of birds and insects stopped all of a sudden, and there was an unnatural quiet. It looked like the forest was making everything darker, even the sunshine that was coming through the trees. David tried to keep his mind off of things by working and fixing up parts of the house that were falling apart. But every night when it got dark, the woods outside seemed to come to life, and he could tell that eyes were watching him through the windows. David thought he saw a wavy shadow dart between the trees one time. Even though it was getting hotter, he started locking all the doors and windows at night. There was more glow in the clearing tonight than ever before. Behind the thick shades, David could see more details against the black trees in the background. The light flickered in a strange way, like it came from a flickering mass floating in the air. It moved slowly left and right, as if taking its time to look at the house, which was only a yard or two from the trees. David knew that he had to end this scary game of cat and mouse for good. He slammed the front door open and marched into the misty night with determined steps toward the light, pulling a flashlight and a hunting knife from his packs. He wouldn't stop until he found out who or what was terrorizing them all the time. But when David shined his flashlight into the thick bush, the yellow glow was gone as quickly as it had come on. David was angry because he couldn't see anything in the pitch. Black trunks. All he could see were more barely glowing prints that led into the darkness. Something that lived in these woods was always one step ahead, which made David feel even more afraid than before. That night, a very loud storm ripped through the forest, trapping David inside the shaky shack. Through windows that rattled, he saw the dark shapes of trees sway fiercely, their branches flay fiercely, their branches flailing around as if they were fighting demons in the strong winds. Strong winds slashed at the old building, threatening to tear it apart at the joints. David kept lighting the oil lamp inside every time it went out, because he didn't want to be completely in the dark. In some way, the cage made me feel even more trapped and suspicious than the storm outside. There was a scary edge to every shadow on the wall. Strange sounds coming from below the storm made David jump at the smallest groan or creak. His mind was racing. The rain turned into a heavy drizzle when dawn finally came, but the woods around them were different. There was a dark, scary feeling in the air under the wet leaves, as if the storm had stirred up a primordial evil. David went outside slowly, climbing over twisted roots and muddy puddles to get to the spot where he had last seen the strange light. Soon, David saw signs that there had been recent damage in the reaching trunks. A few trees were bent out of shape, and the bark had been shaved off in long strips down the sides, letting sap drip like blood. Patches of plants were lying flat, as if they had been stomped on by a huge object. All of them pointed to the same place deeper in the scary forest. As David moved forward, he saw more strange things that made him feel even worse. There was wet clay that was as red as raw meat on the forest floor, where a big piece had been clawed away. Feathers were flying around in the dull air. They were all that was left of a target animal that had been violently torn apart. He saw that something had dug a big, misshapen hole in the muddy ground and was sleeping or burrowing there, keeping a horrible watch over the woods from this unholy den. A stringy strand of saliva hung from a low branch. It had a thick shine that made David's tummy turn. He carefully wiped it off with a stick and held it up to look at how frighteningly human, like the texture was. It was very clear in my mind that I remembered the strange pictures and sounds. This could not have been done by a normal animal. This forest was marked by something huge and evil as its original home, and it was now focused on the lone person who was breaking its rules. Then, out of the strange silence came a blood-curdling screech that broke David's thoughts. It came from everywhere, like the forest was screaming in pain. He quickly turned around, flashing his flashlight over the tall trees. For a split second, he was sure he saw an oddly shaped shadow move too quickly along the edges of his vision. He felt his blood run cold when he realized that something had been watching him the whole time. David quickly turned around and ran away, plunging through sharp branches and clinging vines on his way back to the safety of the house. No safe place could hide the truth that was beating in his head. Whatever was hiding in those untamed woods was much stronger and more dangerous than any person, and it would do anything to get back its territory and the invader inside. Now that he was stuck alone with a darkness that was even stranger than the storm, he was completely at its mercy. Once the rain stopped, the nights got longer and darker, making the forest feel like it was outside of time. David didn't dare close his eyes for more than a few seconds at a time inside the empty house. His nerves were so stressed that every sound, like old wood creaking or leaves rustling outside, made him feel scared. He kept any source of light on and his tools close by, ready for the final, terrifying fight he knew was coming. The thing had stopped being careful about where it hid and was now just hanging around. It was always dark outside, but you could hear heavy footsteps and the snapping of trees under huge weights. David thought he saw a huge shape backlit by the woods one time, which made his heart skip a beat in fear. It was slowly closing the net around its prey, pushing them to the point where they would break. David had horrible hallucinatory dreams during the few times he was able to get some rest. He was dragged into the dark spaces between the trees by clawed hands, monster eyes made of amber looking out of the forest haze. Always the same strange screaming that seemed to shake his bones and had an evil sound that no human throat could make. David knew he couldn't take the siege any longer when dawn finally broke on the fourth night. As his strength and supplies were running out, he waited for any signs of movement to stop before going out into the dark half, light and carefully walking back to where he had last seen the growing den. Thankfully, there were no sounds to accompany his shaky steps through the dead woods. But the twisted trees looked closer than they had before, with branches all around that were turning into scary shapes. David's anxiety grew with every beating heartbeat because of the constant movement in his peripheral vision. He finally found the horrible pit among the wet ferns. He gulped down sickness and stretched his ears as he waited for the killer to show itself. In the middle of the thick quiet, there was a bone-chilling screech that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Then, up ahead, between the trees that reached out, David caught a glimpse of a huge misshapen shape that quickly and gracefully emerged from the shadows. Amber's eyes were the size of dinner plates and were locked on him with a mean look. Her jaws were longer than a man and had sharp teeth that were dripping saliva. The horrible thing screamed again and ran on all fours, getting closer too fast for David to respond. He threw a lit flare into the monster's mouth as it sucked in air, which made an ear-splitting howl that shook the primordial trees to their very cores. David turned and ran through the bush, but he couldn't see where he was going. As he ran, branches hit his flailing arms and legs. Just as the thing hit the walls, he crashed through the cabin door. There was an explosion of splintered wood in anger. Just in time, David slammed the broken door shut against the hits, passing out from shock amidst the terrible sounds of the hunter's rage. When dawn finally broke through, David woke up in a feverish state to an unsettling quiet. He moved the things that were blocking the doorway out of the way and looked outside. He couldn't believe that the area was once again empty, with no signs of the chaos from the night before. The faintly glowing tracks going back into the primordial depths were the only signs. They were a grim warning that there were some secrets in those old woods that were better left undiscovered. David packed up his few things with shaky hands, determined to stay as far away from this place of unholy terror as possible. That evil would let him stay in its territory was still something that was unknown. But one thing was clear. Some darknesses could never be escaped. They could only be lived with a shaking soul from afar. John Miller knew he was lost for sure when he saw the shadows getting longer between the trees. He looked at his phone again, hoping in vain that it had somehow gotten service out here in the middle of nowhere in the last 5 minutes. But the screen wouldn't show anything because the thick forest wouldn't give him any hints on how to get back to the trailhead. At the time, it seemed like such a great idea. A last-minute hiking trip on a clear night when he didn't have to study hard for college. He just wanted to get away to the great unknown in the woods near his home. A chance to go on a real trip instead of a virtual one. But now that it was getting dark and the broad trunks were losing their clear shapes and taking on strange personalities in John's mind, he was beginning to wish he hadn't gone on this trip by himself. He walked more slowly and craned his neck in every direction, looking for any sign that might help him remember the way in. He looked around and saw nothing but a sea of trees, their branches reaching out at him like twisted fingers through the growing darkness. He shook, feeling suddenly uncomfortable under their close observation, if only to get more distance between himself and the getting darker. John sped up and chose a random direction to go in. John didn't know how long he stumbled through the woods without knowing where he was going because he was scared and tired. It was getting darker. His pants were wet from shin splints, and he was gasping for air. That was all he knew. He was afraid that he would lose control at any time. The sound of each tree breaking sounded eerily like someone was following him around. When he tripped over an exposed root and fell, he yelled and scraped his hands on the rough bark. It was already dark. John was tired and was shaking as he lay on the cold forest floor. There were a lot of clouds in the sky, blocking out even the faint light of the stars. On all sides, complete and utter darkness pressed in, and the only sound was his heartbeat pounding in his ears. He rolled over on his back and fumbled for his phone with numb fingers. The useless device wouldn't answer his silent pleas for help, though. It had been so long since he had felt so alone. Just as John thought his frayed nerves couldn't take it any longer, he caught a glimpse of a tiny light deep in the dead woods out of the corner of his eye. He jumped to his feet and ran toward that faraway promise of rescue, his heart racing with new desperation. "Help!" he yelled into the night. "Please help me, I'm lost." His voice cracked as he stumbled toward the dim light. As he got closer, two small golden orbs became clear, unblinking and distant, even though his tears were making it hard for him to see. John stopped in his tracks, his muscles locked up with sudden fear. From the suffocating darkness, two eyes stared back at him, glowing like dying coals. After that, the real darkness of the forest set in. Before John could even realize what was happening, it started to rain hard, jolting him back to the horrible truth of his situation. He scrambled backwards through the wet undergrowth, shivering violently and drenched to the bone in his thin jacket and pants. He did this to get as far away from those horrible yellow eyes that were still burning a hole in his mind. Where did they go? Were they real? Were they real, or were they just a crazy dream that his jumbled mind made up? The rose-colored dawn looked like a dream, because gunmetal clouds covered the sky and let loose torrents of rain that washed away all signs of his invisible following. John fought to stand up as the stinging rain hit him hard. He was feeling sick from a mix of fear and exhaustion. Which way should I go now? It looked the same in every direction. A thick blur of wet tree limbs slowly disappearing into the rain. Then, as it rained hard, a shimmering light danced somewhere ahead in the wet trees. John's chest swelled with new hope, and with the eyes acting as his heart, he lurched stubbornly toward that faint light. As they came out of a small clearing, they saw the broken-down skeleton of an old hunting house. The walls were caved in and covered in thick, tough moss. But inside, one bulb still lit up fiercely. Finally, safety. John slammed through the rotten door into the musty room, almost going crazy with happiness. He took off all of his wet clothes and laid them out by the weak fireplace. He shivered furiously as he pressed his cold hands to the electric bulb's weak heat. Over time, his numb fingers and toes started to feel again, but it hurt like pinpricks. As his awareness solidified, itchy prickles made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. It was clear that someone or something had been here not long ago. The old floorboards have new cuts in them, and the rickety table was just moved. John tensed and turned toward sounds, coming from deeper inside. There was a wooden opening in the corner with bars that looked like the entrance to hell. It was dirty and had fingerprints that were too big to be human. He twisted it open with all his strength, revealing a small basement storage area that was the source of the sneaky skittering. But among the piled-up food and musty bags, he saw a binder that was full of yellowed newspaper clippings. John pulled it free, while his stomach churned at the thought of grainy news stories about unsolved murders and bodies found in these woods with their bodies cut up, and a mysterious sign carved into the bark of trees being the only clue. He had thought the sigil before was just an urban tale, but now it looked back at him like a flickering bulb that would never go out. He knew he wasn't alone in the forest, and all of his light and reason went out. Something had been watching and waiting in the pitch. Black night. John realized as he slammed the weak door of the cabin shut behind him that following the scary tracks that led from the hidden room like breadcrumbs through hell had been a huge mistake. He knew it wouldn't help much against whatever came through the bush at night and killed those offerings. There was a storm coming. John worked quickly with the weak light from the dying bulb to block the doorway as best he could with the things that were still inside. It was a makeshift defense against the things that go bump in the night. He didn't want to start a fire to stay warm because its light would draw attention to him just as easily from anyone in the trees as the dim light above. As the noise outside grew louder, heavy footsteps squelching through mud, branches breaking under the weight of huge trees, John hid the evidence by pulling up loose floors. Each crash made his heart beat faster and faster. They were on their way. His frantic scraping shook the crumbling walls and removed old layers of grime. Something below sparkled dully in the dying light. A crowbar that wasn't finished but is ready to be. John finally got his gun and hid deeper in the shadows, just as the first blows hit the door frame, shaking it back and forth. The wet wood cracked under the forceful blows. As the opening caved in with a splintering cry, pieces flew everywhere. It poured down rain, and in the distance, a tall, stumbling figure could be seen against the darkness. Two round yellow eyes fixed on John as he cowered, his mouth wide open in a wild grin full of sharp teeth. It moved very quickly for its size. Wood screamed as John swung like crazy, and the impact hurt his bones. His attacker fell backwards and slammed into shelves, sending drinks and food flying everywhere. John sprinted up the creaky stairs as soon as he got the chance, hoping to get away from this nightmare. But now that the light was brighter, he could see that it wasn't a scary monster at night. Instead, it was a real person, sized monster, with muscles that moved under fur. That was knotted. When it got back on its feet, it did so incredibly quickly and looked at him again with that horrible glowing eye. He knew those eyes. The thing seemed to smile from the bottom of the stairs. It said, "Not so fast." Little morsel in a voice that sounded like rocks grinding together. The good times are just getting started. As John scampered up the stairs, it jumped up. His panicked prayers were drowned out by the sound of the old wood cracking. Thunder rolled across the sky above him at the same time as his heart was beating fast. In the end, he was stuck between the ground and the storm, with that grinning teeth snapping at his heels. On the top step, John turned around to face his fate with the crowbar stretched out in front of him. Lightning flashed, casting strobing ghosts across the room in the cabin that had been destroyed. In that electric moment, his eyes locked back on the monsters. And it hit him like thunder. He knew those eyes, from before in the dark forest, looking and waiting. With a sad pop, the bulb went out, plunging them into endless darkness. Somewhere below, heavy footsteps started to climb again in a sad way. When the first pale rays of dawn came through the holes in the walls, they found John lying on the ground, completely worn out, and with his crowbar still tightly gripped in his numb fingers. During the long night, the monster must have grown tired of playing with its trapped prey and slunk back into the bush. It hurt John as he slowly pulled himself up from the dusty floors. It hurt like hell, because I had spent another night getting ready for an attack that never came. From the staircase below, he could only hear silence and smell the musty smell of decay. As he slowly made his way down, he was shocked to see that the cabin door was hanging off of one of the hinges in a strange way. Had someone who wasn't following him managed to get away? Or decided to let him go for some other strange reason? It didn't take John long to decide which fate was worse. As soon as I stepped outside, the skeletal remains were hard to see in the bright morning light. Only his desperate tracks, which wound through the clearing, showed what he was going through inside these crumbling walls. John walked after them, feeling numb, and came out into the woods again. But now that it was early morning, the trees that were growing closer looked less scary. Birdsong broke the creepy silence as the forest woke up, not knowing or caring about the horrible things going on inside its branches. John kept going, now relying on his weak instincts more than his senses. After a long time, or just a few seconds, the trees broke in front of him to reveal a familiar country road. He was so tired and happy that his knees gave out. Along the empty asphalt, lone roofs appeared out of the fog like a welcome mirage. Home. Days went by while John got better with his family, watching over him. They smiled and nodded as the safe version of events was told. But when I was alone and quiet, flashes of the past nights came back to me out of the blue. The house, which could be seen through the bushes like a shameful secret, was the scariest thing, and those devilishly familiar eyes would always be there, following his every move no matter how far he ran into the light. In those scary woods, the real scary stuff had just started. He wondered where they were now, always waiting for the next person to wander off and fall into their hands. For John, the trees and their silence would no longer bring him comfort or excitement. He still had a bad feeling that going back into the bush by himself might seal his fate and bring about a darkness that no one can escape. Because somewhere deep in those endless trunks lived a nightmare that was always on the lookout for the outsider it had let go of for now. The end, or maybe just the start,